Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Globe online panel that is devoted to the topic of what is global governance in the time of COVID-19. I am Jacint Jordana, the moderator of this panel, and we have with us four scholars from different parts of the world. Tom Pegram from UCL London, Bela Pertiwi from the University of BINUS in Indonesia, Tussie from FLACSO in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and Wouters from Catholic University in Leuven, Belgium. And we are going to discuss together about about the consequences of COVID-19 for global governance dynamics. I'm going to ask several questions to the panelists, and well, we are going to have initial comments by each panelist, and then we open a conversation, and finally we'll open for all the participants, all the people attending this panel, if you have some questions. Questions, I will ask you to put your questions in the chat, and I will read and direct them to the panels. So let's start. The idea is the whole event is going to be about 1 hour, no more than that. We want to ask the panelists to be short and to be concise in the answers, and then we hope to have a conversation all together. The first question I want to place all you, is about how you consider the global governance has been affected by the COVID, by the pandemic, in the public health and related policy areas, including pharmaceuticals. Do you consider that global governance has changed in the during the last year, during this year, because of the pandemic? If this is the case, in which direction do you think we are observing changes? And do you think that these changes are going to increase, to be consolidated in the years to come? So, please, I will ask Tom Pegram from UCL to be the first to provide an answer to these questions.
Hello, can you see me? Yeah, can everyone see me and hear me?
Yeah, yes. No, we cannot see you, but we can hear you. Okay, now it's working.
Good. Okay, that's a relief. Well, very good to be here with you all in these strange times. So where are we with COVID and global health governance? And I guess you might say that we're, at least in the UK, perhaps at the end of the beginning. So with that strong caveat, I mean, we're just about to head into a possible second wave here without a functioning testing or track and trace system. So trying to think of a good analogy for where we are with public health at the global scale, perhaps one analogy might be something along the lines of a bird strike on a jet plane. I think that we do have a system which was actually designed in many ways to deal with this eventuality. This wasn't a black swan event, to mix my metaphors. We have past experience in this space with the SARS, with MERS, with Ebola. There was also a lot of pandemic preparation by the World Health Organization, by diverse governments over recent years. But what we do see is very different outcomes across settings. So here in the UK, just to pick on my own home base, we now have between 42 and 65,000 deaths. And that contrasts with, say, in Vietnam, a total of 35 deaths. And I think this does raise important questions for global health governance and its domestic public health systems. The US and the UK were both rated the two best prepared countries for a pandemic by the Global Health Security Index in 2019, and that metric hasn't really held up very well. Indeed, South Korea, I read in the Sunday Times, was so impressed with the UK's pandemic planning that they copied it wholesale. The difference is that they actually implemented it. So they have 385 deaths recorded so far. So what does this country variation have to do with global health governance? Well, I think it clearly demonstrates that the WHO should be serving a vital coordination function against the risk of this kind of state failure. But in reality, we know that it enjoys very few tools to actually monitor outbreaks, to coordinate pandemic planning, and most crucially, to allocate resources to ensure implementation. And the WHO Constitution actually grants the body incredibly wide formal authority, but no powers of implementation. So I just note that the critics often neglect the fact that WHO design makes it completely dependent upon state cooperation to achieve its mandate. What are the prospects of member states granting the WHO the authority to actually deal with these kinds of situations as we move forward? Well, there's that possibility, which I guess we'll discuss further. But at the moment, I think COVID is highlighting many of the stresses and strains that the system is under.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. And now we are going to ask Bela Pertiwi for her comments on that question.
Okay, yeah. If the question is that whether there is changes to global governance, I might say yes, both in terms of actors and approaches. I can't say for broader global governance, but if but based on what I have been writing on the global health governance, I see there are changes, but in terms of actors and approaches. So I mean, if we talk global health governance, I mean it consists of it's a complex governance consisting of sub-governance, right? From infectious disease, non-communicable disease, and then distributive issues such as access to medicine and so on. And within each of the sub-governance itself, there are different approaches, or this. I'm going to say that this governance is often framed differently. So, for example, there is the literatures. I think take note that pandemic influenza, for example, has been mostly framed as an evidence-based medicine with medicine approach, more scientific approach. Because if you look at pandemic influenza, it has been around for a very long time. WHO seems to take good controls of it, and there has been well-established pharmaceutical industries as well. We have medication and so on. But HIV, on the other hand, HIV/AIDS, in the other hand, mostly framed in terms of human rights issues, because this disease affected specific groups of people, which leads to stigmatization. Right. So now the question is then, how is the COVID-19 is framed right now? Who are the actors and approaches used in this during this pandemic? I have tried to look at the mappings of actors and approaches in the governance of coronavirus from SARS in 2012 and 2002, and then MERS in 2012 until now, and COVID. So if you look at SARS, it also emerged from China. It seems, and I tried to look at the roles of these actors in three required responses for a pandemic. The first one, the role in providing financial and material assistance, the second in knowledge dissemination and surveillance, and the third in rule-making behavior. So it seems like in SARS, WHO seems still played significant role almost in these three aspects, but we see that the World Bank contribute in giving financial assistance, including to China. And then in March in 2012, we see WHO also still, I think, play a leading role, even though perhaps more active role, because it also collaborate with the Food and Agriculture organizations and also World Organization for Animal Health. Then how about COVID? Oh, okay, so I see in SARS and MERS, WHO still play a leading role, and scientific approach still dominate the management of the disease. But in terms of COVID, WHO yes still provide significant material assistance, also rule making. But in terms of financial assistance, because it's highly infectious, so the impact is broader than the previous two coronavirus, SARS and MERS. So I see more crowd in this in the financial assistance, because we see not only the World Bank but also IMF and G20 and other private actors also involved here. So I see there is a changing approach in the governance of coronavirus from the more scientific approach in SARS and MERS to more economic approach during the COVID pandemic. I think, yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Bela. The next panelist is Diana Tussie from FLACSO, Argentina. Diana, can you? Diana? So if...
yes.
Okay. Diana, hi.
Yes,
yes please.
Hello, I'm sorry. Well, thank you for the opportunity. I mean, these are testing times, both politically, intellectually, personally. So thank you for the opportunity to reflect on these times and see how we adapt and cope, both, as I say, intellectually, politically, personally. And these are, of course, mixed, and something that I think we have to be aware of. What, of course, I see is an abandonment, a breakdown of global governance in these testing times. But I don't see it totally unrelated to the backlash that we have been suffering for some time now, maybe a couple of years. What I see, and this is affecting the global governance of health, is heightened competition between the forces, between hegemonies in a way, but also between the forces of nationalism and the forces of global cooperation. So in a way, I mean, of course, one is very worried that the marriage that we have enjoyed over the last years between capitalism, democracy, and global governance have turned sour. The question is, can they be rescued? I mean, can this marriage or this triad still be rescued? And I think it can, but what we are seeing now, it can and it will be different. Of course, I think there will be a different mix. But what we're seeing now is, and this is worrying, is affecting global governance of health. I'm not going to speak of national governance of health. But what we're seeing is a mix of withdrawal and of predatory practices between states and in many in many areas, I mean. Yet the demand for global governance of health has been heightened, is very real, is very serious, is very necessary. Much of it is supplied by civil society cooperation, by foundations, by private-public partnerships. So civil society and the private sector are picking up here in terms of vaccine production and in terms of vaccine distribution. These are important steps. These are very huge steps, actually. They are leading part of the global governance of health in a way. The question is still what will happen with states? Will states accompany these initiatives, or will states grab these initiatives in a context of geopolitical competition. I think we're going through a phase of anti-hyper global governance, anti-hyper globalization, Danny Roderick would say, which is not necessarily a phase of anti-cooperation. I mean, COVID-19 has shown interconnectedness. It has shown interconnectedness of humanity. And what we're seeing is that this interconnectedness is now being woven, not by free trade, as we have seen over the last 40 years, maybe, but by this necessity to govern health. So we're going to see perhaps more global governance in problem-solving areas than in these global sort of areas of let's organize the world around a certain principle, which was free trade, and now will be probably cooperation on health. How and who is probably a question that I will leave for later on. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you very much for your words. And now the last panelist, Jan Wouters from Leuven University. Please, Jan.
Okay, thank you. Let me start by saying that global health governance is a big name for what may not be a very impressive thing in the facts, because it's actually a patchwork of all kinds of bodies and players with global and regional and national levels and what have you. So, but it's very hard to call it a systematic and well-integrated system. So, I mean, it's clear that we have now witnessed some of the intrinsic limitations of the system. But even the things that have been around for a long time have not functioned overly well, or have functioned but have not been noticed. Anybody of you knows the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board? The Global Preparedness Monitoring Board has issued a report in September 2019 warning exactly for the kind of pandemics like COVID-19. Who took notice? Who took action? Nobody. Then the WHO, we all know that it really has shown some defects in its dealing with COVID-19. And I'm sure there are certain, let's say, instruments that should be revised and should be improved. We all know the international health regulations. There are such good rules. I mean, we know that the latest revision from 2005 is a fairly good set of rules, but they of course need to be respected. Countries should be transparent and cooperative. And it's also clear that they need to be revised and need to be complemented. An important gap in the current international health regulations, for instance, is that they are really quite, say, silent with regard to travel restrictions. You really, if we see anything, I mean, air travel is something that we should have restricted far more early on in the disease. And that should, I mean, it calls for a kind of amendment and revision of the international health regulation. But I'm also inclined to say it's not just a matter of instruments, it's also a problem of leadership. And it's interesting to look a bit back in time to 2002, 2003, when we had another important outbreak, the SARS outbreak, and when the then Director General of the WHO, Gro Brundtland, was much more hands-on and really in a certain way pushed the limits of our own authority, being very tough with China, trying to really force more cooperation and openness. I must say the contrast between Brundtland's actions and the actions of the current Director General of the WHO are pretty dissimilar, and I think we should draw also some lessons in that respect for the whole question of, let's say, the influence of China, the weakness, so to say, of the WHO. Maybe a last point, if I can just throw that into our discussion, is at the level of the European Union. Because, you know, last week we had the State of the Union of the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and she has called upon Europeans to bring about a true European Union health union. And that's a laudable idea. We know that many things have gone wrong in Europe at the European and the national level in responding to COVID. But the very problem is that the health union of the EU, if it comes about, rests on very, very shaky grounds because of the very complicated setup of the competences that have been given to the European Union in the area of health. These are very weak and partially contested competences. So, I mean, it's going to be difficult to build a real strong EU program and let's say, tools and instruments with regard to health on the current legal foundations. That's going to be a real challenge, and I'm sure there will be turf battles between member states as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shen. So, I don't know if you want to comment some others panelists' comments, but if not, I can place you a second question that also we can, I will ask you to answer shortly. That's about beyond the global governance of public health. Do you think that the pandemic is affecting also other areas of global governance, for example, trade or even security, meaning that actors and institutions behave now in a global level in a different way to design or to think about global public policies, or maybe are emerging new actors taking a new role as a consequence of the pandemic? In some way, do you think that maybe there is a retrenchment towards national states and there is a reduction of some spheres of global governance? So what do you think about this, whether the COVID is making an impact in global governance beyond the health, the public health issues? Maybe we can, you can answer this in the same order as you did before. So Tom, you may want to answer, comment on that.
Sure. Where's my video?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think certainly COVID is ricocheting throughout the global governance system across all sorts of different functional technical systems, obviously the economy and security and elsewhere. In terms of a broad reflection on impact, I think it is too early to say exactly, but I think what COVID has done is has exposed the systemic fragility of our civilization. A virus in Wuhan, in one part of the world, can become a virus throughout the whole world. It can break down supply chains. It can break down the social fabric within countries, between countries. And so I suppose you could say that COVID was just a big enough shock to demonstrate the systemic fragility that we confront, and it does raise really serious questions about how we do global governance, and questions which people like Ian Golden have been reflecting on for many years, whether legacy global governance structures are really fit for purpose to deal with these kinds of catastrophic risks. And I mean, if we're thinking about the complexity of COVID from a governance perspective, it's not just about the transmission of COVID-19, the development of a vaccine, and so on, which in itself is highly complex, but certainly viable, given we have the technology, the understanding, the expertise. But it's also about much more difficult, complex interactions, or difficult to understand interactions between human and natural systems, of course, which likely made this transmission more likely in the first place. And research trying to understand how to govern the interface between human and ecological systems. This is really, I think, an area which practitioners, policymakers, and scholars are just beginning to grapple with. But certainly, ecology scholars are linking these new diseases, including COVID, to growth-oriented economic practices around agricultural intensification, around biodiversity destruction. So this really requires a system frame for understanding what kinds of policies might be adequate to addressing these problems. And much of our legacy toolkit is quite siloed within particular policy domains. So of course, this complexity extends to human social systems. We have now a lot of fear, a lot of sort of denial driving a retrenchment, as you put it, towards national states. And unfortunately, this exclusionary nationalist momentum fails to acknowledge that we really are all in this together, and that these kinds of integrated, highly complex systems are only as strong as their weakest links. So, as I say, it's early days really in thinking about the impact of COVID on global governance and how actors and institutions handle global public policy. But I think we're already beginning to glimpse the second and third order shocks or effects. You know, the problems sometimes that arise through flawed solutions that then create new problems. So using the hammer of closing national borders, closing ports, the UN is now warning that the COVID response has impacted supply chains. This has compounded a crisis in levels of hunger in Africa and the Middle East. So trying to draw all of these strands together in terms of thinking about how to develop good solutions that don't create new problems is an incredibly challenging task, I think, for global governance policy. And just a brief reflection on when it comes to new actors. I think one new actor which we should pay attention to is social media and emerging technology. Certainly, we've seen the politicization of what were or are really scientific issues, such as the efficacy of face masks. The Director General of the World Health Organization has warned that we're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic of fake news, which threatens to undermine public trust in science. And the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has even identified cyber-enabled disinformation campaigns as an amplifier of existential risk. So I think there's much to be pondered when it comes to thinking about the role, the kinds of authority structures, the kinds of accountability mechanisms that we currently have, and whether they are up to the task in terms of ensuring a healthy information ecosystem. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Tom. Let's now ask to Bela Pertiwi about this question of the transformations of the global governance in a broad sense because of the COVID pandemic.
Okay. So is the pandemic affecting other areas of global governance? I would say yes, of course. Particularly, following from what I explained earlier, that there is a changing approach in the way we deal with the pandemics, from perhaps mostly a scientific approach to because of the scale and the economic impact of the pandemic. So of course, from here we could say that the pandemic has significant impact to global governance on economy. Global economic governments. I don't know to what extent it will last, but at least from what we see is that there are more actors from the economic governance, such as the World Bank, for example, right, has over a significant amount of financial assistance, both in long terms and also fast track, to help countries to deal with the pandemic. Also, the regional development banks, for example, ADB and IBEI, also provide technical assistance and also fundings as well. The IMF also have various mechanisms to help member states financially, and also over debt relief to poor countries to deal with the pandemic. But I think it's not only in terms of economy, but in other areas. For example, climate change. I couldn't say for this pandemic, but I mean before the pandemic, the WHO, for example, has included agenda on climate change, and also has global strategies on health, environment, and climate change in 2019. I think that that demonstrates how there are nexus or more interconnectedness among global governance on various issues. In terms of emerging actors, this is not a new actor, but it's just interesting for me to observe the foreign policy and global health minister, the FPGHI, which was formed in 2016, right, among countries such as Indonesia, France, Norway, Brazil, Senegal, South Africa, and also Thailand, to try to mainstream health issues within foreign policy. And now with the pandemic, it seems like they try to revive this cooperation, but I don't know how significant or to what extent their cooperation will influence significantly to the global governance on pandemics. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Bela. And let's now move to Diana. What do you think about this question, Diana?
Yes, hello. I think, of course, that COVID-19 is a severe shock. I mean, to the whole system, it's a severe shock to global governance. And I think, of course, that global governance is under stress, or has been under stress for some time before the outbreak of COVID-19. COVID-19 has exposed and made it has exposed this breakdown and made it even more serious, of course. The problem of leadership that Jan mentioned, I think, is spot on. There is a delegitimization going on in global governance, some that we have not been used to in a way. We have been used to the delegitimization coming from civil society. The anti-globalization movements in Seattle, Hamburg, Cancun, etc. Every time we had a G20 meeting or a WTO meeting in Hong Kong, there was a big delegitimization or a process of delegitimization coming from civil society for quite some time. The difference now is that that the delegitimization is coming from governments themselves. Although I think governments are torn in a way between the need to cooperate and the need and the retrenchment that is going on. The delegitimization of the World Health Organization and the very weak response to the pandemic, despite the warnings, is not unrelated to the geopolitical competition. I mean, and the contrast between Brundtland and Tedros is, of course, is part of this geopolitical competition. I mean, the seriousness is, what I see as the new actors, is that the tension between the supply and demand for global governance is stimulating the entrance of new actors, of civil society foundations, the Global Alliance for Vaccine, the initiative, the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation, and other foundations that are moving in this direction. The other important actor that is taking front stage and is Europe. Europe is playing a constructive role model at this moment, and hopefully this umbrella will be opened bigger and wider. As Bela mentioned, the cooperation between emerging markets has slowed down. And of course, that is also related to changes in government. Brazil, for example, has been very, I would say, very anti-international cooperation under the Bolsonaro government in the last 3 years. And that has affected the cooperation between emerging markets. So what I see is, in short, the new actors coming from civil society, from foundations, from the Global Alliance for Vaccine Initiative, Europe as a role model, and a couple of, I would say, China as well, despite the fact that COVID-19 erupted in China. We still have to see if this will be an opportunity for China to take up a more responsible role in global governance than it has so far. That's all from me.
Thank you very much, Diana. And now the last panelist, Jan, your turn.
Hi. Well, 4 points with regard to this particular question. First of all, I mean, how is this crisis affecting the what I would call the traditional channels of global governance, and in particular the diplomatic channels? I find that very interesting. I hear many diplomats and politicians saying that it's really, in a way, limiting their efficiency to a great extent. When you have online meetings like the present one, it can be okay to basically state your point of view, but for real negotiations, for real, let's say, give and take, all the kind of practical and also human and psychological aspects that come with diplomatic functions. I mean, I think this is a real impoverishment. So, I mean, the very fact that our diplomatic toolkit has been severely constrained by this pandemic has already a kind of consequences upon our system of and functioning of global governance system. I think also the bullying that has come up, I've been really impressed by the fact that in diplomatic relations there is now much more direct bullying and threats than at least what I noticed until a few years ago. I'm not sure if that has to do with it. The second thing, in your question, you asked also about are new apps emerging, and I think Tom is absolutely right about social media, but I think that especially when we think of COVID-19, it's quite clear that the private sector will be ever more important. And this has all kinds of pros, but also all kinds of questions. The pro is, of course, as was also said in yesterday's United Nations commemoration declaration, and you know, yesterday they adopted this declaration to commemorate the 75th birthday of the United Nations. It says that we need to have more stakeholders involved, including not just all kinds of regional organizations and academia and NGOs and so on, but also, of course, the private sector. And that's a process that's been going on for quite a while already with a number of specialized agencies of the UN, including the FAO, including the WIPO, and so on. I think also in WHO we see that role and influence growing. But there is, of course, also the question of corporate capture, and there is a question to what extent we become too much dependent on certain corporate interests. Look at the rush for a vaccine and the pre-orders that are being made, not just by states, but also by, for instance, the European Commission, international institutions. I mean, we will have to carefully look at this role and the responsibilities of the private sector in new ways of global governance. Then there is your retrenchment question, Jacint, and I like that question because, in fact, we have just published together a book on borders in Europe. Remember that great book. I hope there is already the softcover edition, the cheaper edition available in any event. When we wrote that book, we were thinking still of Europe in terms of the Europe we know before the pandemic, with the Schengen zone, with free movement of persons, goods, what have you. Look at Europe now. I mean, we have seen all these purely national responses, the closing down of borders, the prohibition of travel, the suspension of the Schengen zone, what have you. So, I mean, there's been a kind of new nationalism also within the European Union. Borders are absolutely back. And I think that's something that we really reckon with and which will have indeed an effect upon international cooperation. It's quite remarkable that, especially when we see that there is an ever more strong need for cooperation to combat such a virus, that at the political level, we are basically going back to national territories and borders. It's something that really should think about also in the context of the Globe project. Last but not least, in terms of thinking for solutions for the future and redesigning global governance and so on, I must confess that for the moment I have been struck by a total lack of creative thinking. It's also maybe a criticism of ourselves, but I think it has to do also with something else. I think many of us, especially also the diplomats and politicians, we fear that by opening up the box of creative thinking, we may risk of even throwing away what we have already. So the processes, the institutions, the clubs, the instruments that we have already in global governance, they are indeed fragile things, as we have seen also over the last couple of years. And I think in that sense, I mean, in a certain way, we try to nurture and cultivate what we have already. I also read that very much in that commemoration declaration of the United Nations adopted yesterday. It's very much the same stuff. It's very much repeating what's already there in the United Nations Charter since 1945. But of course, you understand, because if we start throwing away even that, I think that the problems will only, say, become even more complicated. So, I mean, yes, we need to think and prepare for the future while building on what we have achieved already. But the problem is, everything is so fragile that we are even afraid of starting to rediscuss what we built up in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jean, for your insights on that. Now we can open, we have about 15 minutes left, and we can open for questions or comments from the people participating, attending this panel. If somebody wants to, yes, I see Jean-Marie Anto, lower the hand. So also, if you want to write, put your question in the chat, it's also possible. But Jean-Marie, please move forward. I think you can turn on your micro.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I want to thank all you for organizing this panel discussion, which is critical in these circumstances, and highly appreciated views and opinions. I would like to emphasize an issue that I think it needs perhaps a bit of attention, that it's the extent to which the pandemic has broken down the rules operating the dialogue between science and politics for the last decades. And I think that I can see this breakdown reflected in two different areas. One is the crisis of the current paradigm of the public agency. And you can see very similar indications that the public health agencies have been jeopardized by the political power. We have indications in not only in WHO, we have indications in CDC in US, we have indications in UK, in many different places. So we see progressively the political power regarding the scientific evidence in the context of a weakening of the public agencies. And I think that here, as said before, we need to deal with an unfinished agenda. We need to take care of what we have, but we need to think about the new reality where this has been jeopardized. And the other indication of this crisis of the dialogue between politics and science, to me, is the role of scientific advice, which is related to the other. But we have seen growing evidence in many different countries and globally of lack of formal scientific advice in the way that we have known in previous decades. And I think that this, you can see this crisis. I mean, one example is UK, where there is an independent scientific committee, the independent SAGE, in a way in opposition or in counterbalance with the official scientific committee. But you have similar experiences in many other countries, not in all them. And I think that we can assume that this is a crisis that it's confined within the demarcation of health, but it may be relevant for other sectors as well.
Thank you for the points you raised. I think Diana is already raised her hand, and maybe I guess he wants to react to your comments. Please, Diana, go ahead. Well, if not, maybe any of the other panelists, they want to react to this issue of the connection between science and politics during the pandemic.
I can react.
Great,
yeah?
Please go ahead. Yes.
Well, I hadn't raised my hand, but I can react. It's a very interesting question, and I think that needs to be picked up. The breakdown between science and politics has happened and happened before the pandemic. But what I think has happened is that scientific cooperation, international scientific cooperation, has marched on despite this tension between politics and science. What I do think is also very interesting in the question is that what we're seeing ahead of us as a challenge is a mix between unfinished business and the new responsibilities. And the new responsibilities will have to do precisely in the area of health. I think climate change will be another one, and also scientific cooperation, which has taken the lead. So there will be three new agendas that can lead us ahead in terms of reconstructing global governance. And I think science is one, as we said, health is another, and climate change is something that is coming up as something where the interconnectedness of the world is very much on the table. And I think this is an interesting contrast between the unfinished business, as Josep was saying, and the challenges ahead. Because what one sees now is that social values are taking the lead, or at least the need to put social values into social cooperation is coming up very much up front. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. Maybe another panelist wants to say something about that. Yes, Tom, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I think it's a really important point, and there's an awful lot that one could say, but I think something which particularly strikes me is that science does seem to be struggling with how it's an ongoing issue in terms of how do scientists communicate science to the public. And certainly when science gets weaponized for political ends, that creates an even more difficult scenario where there's often either science is being used selectively or it's being distorted. And one of the key issues, I think, which really highlights this challenge in the COVID space, but with broader implications, is the issue of exponentiality. So exponential rates of increase in infection. This is well known in psychological research to be a real challenge to human cognition. And there was a very interesting press conference where Angela Merkel was explaining very clearly what exponential increase actually means, the public policy implications of exponential infection rates. And I thought it was a masterclass in public education and communication. But it needs somehow, that sort of messaging needs to cut through. And there's an awful lot of noise, and it's hard to identify signal amongst all that noise. And of course, there are parallels to climate change. The fact is, if we kept all the carbon in the ground today, warming would continue to increase to probably over 2 degrees in any case, because we're locked in to a degree of global warming. And as Greta Thunberg tweeted yesterday, you know, when she was 8 years old in 2005, so we have essentially released a third of all carbon emissions into the atmosphere since 2005. We've emitted half of all carbon emissions into the atmosphere since 1990. So the ramifications of these sorts of that science and the ability to explain what that actually means, implications for public policy, I think are really, really vital, and we're struggling on that front.
Thank you, Tom. Maybe there are more questions from the participants or the people that are attending this panel. Please, if any of you that wants to raise some question or some comment to the panelists. That's the moment. Or also you can write a question using the chat system. If I don't see more questions, but I have a final question for the panelists. With this question, we probably can finish the panel. That's about the feature of global governance and traditional international organizations, as was referred in the United Nations and some other very well-established international organization. No? So, do you think that in the context of the pandemic, there is a delegitimization of these organizations, where the growing polarization of several hegemons in the world and the emergence of a multiplicity of new actors is creating a sort of delegitimization or losing legitimation by the traditional international organizations in the context of COVID-19? So, please, if you want to answer, maybe in the same order as we did before, starting with Tom.
Okay. Well, I mean, this is the real crystal ball question. So I really have no idea. But I think the fault lines as they currently stand are becoming visible. The fault lines, that is. So you have Richard Haas writing in Foreign Affairs in April, made for very depressing reading. I mean, for Haas, COVID is going to accelerate history towards a new Cold War rather than reshape it. And so I think he definitely sees an acceleration towards delegitimization and all of the challenges that go along with that. In the opposing corner, you have the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, whose Twitter feed has been quite dramatic in recent months. I mean, the Secretary General has been calling for a new model of global governance, arguing for a Dumbarton Oak process as a prelude to a new San Francisco moment. But he also has been quite candid that we are up against some pretty formidable forces here, what he's called the four horsemen of geostrategic tension, climate crisis, growing global mistrust, and the quote dark side of the digital world. So we do see some activity in the context of UN 75 calling for a new model of inclusive global governance. However, the delegitimation of these structures, not only among member states, but also national voting publics, is going to make this task very, very difficult. And also, I suppose, sort of reflecting on Richard Haas's point, I mean, it depends a little bit on how important you think the US is in this sort of geopolitical global governance theater. Will a Biden presidency make a difference? Will it cause a system reset? One imagines that WHO funding would be restored, that the US would be participating in COVID multilateral initiatives, but Biden faces a serious social situation in the US, which could be unpredictable, particularly when it comes to, say, WTO conflicts and so on. So at the moment, we seem to be experiencing something of a crisis in the global order, combined with a crisis in the country that was until recently leading that global order, which I think raises the very good question, you know, what happens next? And I don't think we have a clear line of sight on that at the moment. But what we do have is this gathering destabilization, and as Diane and Jan have sort of intimated, you know, there are well-resourced actors that are taking advantage of that situation. I mean, Oxfam recently released a report showing that wealthy nations have already cornered more than half of the COVID-19 vaccine candidates. And at the same time, globally, 500 million people are expected to be pushed into poverty by the economic fallout from the pandemic. So we've got a situation of destabilization. This might be an opportunity for global governance, creative thinking. But I guess the key question for us is, how do we start vectoring in that direction? And how do we increase our collective capacity to keep vectoring in that direction? And that is a difficult question.
Thank you, Tom. So let's now move to Bela Pertiwi about this general question about the future of global governance.
Okay, so I'm a little bit more optimist here in the way that I think will international traditional international organization be able to cope with delegitimization, or will the pandemic create fragmentation? I think it will go both ways. I think in the one hand, I feel like the international organization, the traditional IO, will keep its central role. Despite many criticisms and many weaknesses, I think some examples, for example, the IHR, the International Health Regulation, even though there are many weaknesses from the regulation, but I think this pandemic demonstrate a better transparency among member states and compliance to the IHR. I think Jen also mentioned earlier that during SARS, for example, China was not so transparent on the outbreak of SARS. It took 3 months even after the government report on the outbreak. The local government still denied access to the WHO to visit the city. So and that's also the case with MERS. I think Saudi's governments didn't pay attention to the report on the outbreak of MERS in the country. So that's why the actor reporting the outbreak need to cooperate with private sector dealing with this alert system. So there's also the lack of transparency here. But during the COVID, despite there are still criticism on how China handling the pandemic within its territory. But I think the pandemic outbreak in the end of December, and then on 1st January, China report to the WTO and also willing to share the genome to the WTO on January 10. I think it's quite more responsive compared to the previous. So I feel like there is increasing transparency among member states and compliance to the IHR. Also, in terms of the role or in terms of the WHO itself, yes, there are also criticism that it couldn't impose rules to member states, but I still see that the WHO still perform a relatively good job in terms of norm setting. Social distancing, for example, I don't know how significant it is in the developed countries, but say, for example, in countries such as Indonesia became the last country that closed its border in the beginning of the pandemic, because still concerned about the economic impact of the pandemic. It's also the last country that report the report of the first case in the region in Southeast Asia. So and in this kind of country, what I feel is that information from the WHO and also this new norm, social distancing, become a guidance that guidance at least for the society how to behave in this pandemic, because the government really I think not sufficiently transparent on this. So we through social media, as what Tom also mentioned, social media play important role, how we could access information directly from the Twitter, from the WHO website, and so on. And I think the global governance also play a more important role, because I think the pandemic, if we remember when the pandemic hits in the beginning, it hit more developed countries, right? And until now, it's still affected major powers such as India, United States, and so on. So there is like a vacuum of leadership here, and that is why global governance for me still I think becomes, if you say, the only tool that could be that should be maintained. But of course, if you ask whether there will be fragmentation, yes, there will be fragmentation, but it will depend on how we frame the future pandemic. Will it be more on the economic approach, the security approach, or other approach? It will also determine who are the key actors there. I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Bela. Thank you very much. Now we move to Diana Tussie from FLACSO, Buenos Aires.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jacint, for the questions, and thank you for the opportunity. I think that the process of delegitimization is going on. I mean, not just a very slow process, now it's becoming rather taking up speed. And I think also with a mixed picture that I'm going to expose in a bit, in a minute. There's also some questions of capture. I mean, the capture in the last week of the Inter-American Development Bank, I would say the grabbing of the presidency of the Inter-American Development Bank by the United States last week in a process that is not fully legitimate in many dimensions, is an indication of the times that we're living through, maybe not the times that we will be living through in the future, but the times that we're living through in the present. And what, of course, one sees is that established organizations are taking a big hit, definitely. Some are suffering a mixed picture of delegitimization. I think in the WHO, it's a mixed picture. There is some, of course, delegitimization, but as it's becoming more necessary, as my colleagues have shown, the legitimization or the technical legitimization of the WHO is moving on and can move on. I cannot foresee a full breakdown of global governance, nor can I imagine a full return to the status quo ante. The question is whether we can engage in some kind of cooperation and reassert the utility of global governance in specific areas. And that, I think, hinges a lot on a very specific date, that is November 3. I think that the big hit that we have taken is that the country that was the pillar, the underpinning of global governance, or what was the underpinning at least, has withdrawn and has been in a process of I would say more than retrenchment, but has hit global governance very seriously. So the question is whether can the US regain its equilibrium? Can it regain its interest in global governance? And in parallel, if China can develop a more ethical, as opposed to an instrumental sense of global governance. The question is if the this pair is important in terms of leadership. Trump just be an interlude? Will the Democrats offer a more amicable agenda that can build bridges in terms of functional cooperation? That, of course, is a question that I cannot answer and will probably not answer until December 1. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you very much for your comments. Now we are going to move to the last panelist, Jan Wouters. Jan?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Heavy responsibility for me to make some remarks. Look, I don't want to do doom thinking, but I'm very optimistic, to be very honest. And I think we need to carefully study the lessons of history. And of course, history never repeats itself exactly. But I mean, it's I think quite interesting for us to study what happened to some international organizations before in human history. Let's think of the League of Nations. What happened to the League in the absence of American, say, participation? It was from the outset without the US. There was this kind of withdrawal of a number of other powers. And I think that, I mean, we see currently a world with some forms of withdrawals. It goes from Brexit at the EU level to withdrawal from certain international bodies and international agreements by the United States. But I mean, for me, withdrawals are a very interesting but worrying indicator of, let's say, forms of disengagement and maybe, say, international modes of governance that are becoming less functional. Another thing that I really think we have to keep an eye on is the evolution of armament. I mean, we have seen in the past that the big armament moves among the major European countries at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, were basically building up an accident that was going to happen at some stage in Sarajevo. But I think that we really have to carefully look at what is this kind of, I think, poisonous cocktail between rearmament, nationalism, the retreat of democracy. And I mean, what can we basically look for? I think we have to look for more leadership, that's clear, but the problem is leadership is a very, very scarce good nowadays, both at the level of international organizations and at the level of nation states. What I really would like us to think more about is how we can really ensure a resilient, vibrant, and critical civil society within as many countries as possible. I think that is really so essential for keeping up, let's say, international cooperation, a spirit of, let's say, a kind of positive attitude towards solving and working together international problems. And I really think that global governance more than ever needs to localize and see how we cannot just depend on political leaders, the traditional Westphalian recipes of the past, but really how we can make sure that we involve those resilient and critical players of civil society. So they have to organize nationally, but also very much across boundaries. And they have to be given a serious role, much more serious than what we currently have with the consultative status here and some other local consultations there. But that's a big challenge for the future, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Well, with this intervention, we will conclude here the panel. I want to thank you very much to the panelists, the 4 panelists, for their comments and also ideas and even suggestions. And also I thank you for the attendees for being in this online panel. And also I want to inform for those of you that are interested that if you want to know more about challenges of global governance, trends, issues that are now really being discussed in the area of global governance, please visit our GLOBE website. GLOBE is a European project, H2020 funded project, and we are having a lot of videos, blogs, webinars, and other documents about the trends and the challenges currently discussed in global governance. So thank you very much, and hope you enjoy this panel.